on continue avec, sorry, in English as well for our guests. The last session we talked about global health, right, with Stefan Elba and Dagmar Vodicek, global health and infrastructure. And it turned out to be actually a very interesting session, I thought. There were two presentations, and they turned basically around the question of control rooms in two different ways, completely different ways. The one was a control room, so Stefan Elba talked about control rooms for emergency operations, so EOCs, emergency operation centers for health emergencies. And then Dagmar Vodicek talked about control rooms for doing research on potential risk-bringing health crises. And both were organized around this sort of logic of control room, which was very interesting. The first one then, Stefan Elba's, the control room of the EOC was used for management of populations in times of crisis, reminiscent of Foucault, and we discussed Foucault a little bit last week. And then the second model, Vodicek's model about research centers, was more on the matter of doing isolated research on the one hand, dangerous substances, but then on the other hand, substances which could become political issues, civic peace issues, if you like to put it that way. So both of the presentations were interested in the way that experiences of health risk were presented and organized and governed. Stefan Elba talked about site ontology, was inspired by Heidegger and Wittgenstein, and talked about the way that these sites, these emergency organization centers, were configuring our reality, the social reality, and how they were in their way somehow structured or prefigured by the reality that they existed in. And he also talked about this Latourian concept, the oligopticon, so the opposite of almost the opposite of the panopticon of Foucault, of Bentham from the 18th century, and then Foucault popularized in Discipline and Punish from 1975, I think. So this idea in the oligopticon, we look inward, where our focus is inward into intensifying expertise instead of looking outward and generalizing control and discipline. So that was quite an interesting contribution to the debate as well. And then it was Dagmar Vodicek who talked about the bunker, laboratory as a bunker. So she even used this word bunker. So some health infrastructures are correlated with the way the public sees risk. And so there's a perceived need, at least, to isolate the research activities so that the public will neither be hurt nor alarmed, and that this has its own sort of logic of securitization. And then we talked a little bit, finally, about the dual use dilemma, a very important concept for us for risk studies. Dual use is this idea which is almost always attached to technology in one way or another, that all technologies can both do good or evil. And there are lots of good examples. The most famous one is the atomic energy, of course, which can do very good, wonderful things and create and heat millions of households, and on the other hand, annihilate millions of people. But essentially, any technology can be used this way. And it links to this Platonic idea of the pharmakon you might have heard about. Pharmakon, the Greek word, means both poison and remedy. And that any drug, essentially, even in modern times, that can help you can potentially kill you. So this dual use idea is very important for ethics, for politics, but also for just understanding the way we organize our concepts in scientific research. Voila, then today we are going to talk about energy security. And at the heart of this question is, at least for me, we'll see, we'll find out soon what our guests have to say. For me, and this won't surprise Izabela, whom I know very well, Johannes a bit less, but that the question of what is energy security. So I would start, and in the little work I've done on this, quite unsuccessful work I've done on this.
It's very inspiring.
But asking the definition, what is energy security, and what does it mean to secure in terms of energy? Who is secure? Who secures? What is insecure? What causes insecurity in the context of energy? What agency provides energy security, and what actors threaten energy security? But I think, and now I'm speculating a little bit about the next 2 hours, I think both our guests share the hypothesis that energy security goes beyond energy. There's always some sort of a supplement to security. It transcends energy security. In other words, security that comes from energy is not energetic itself. It always links to some sort of social structure or personal structure or economic structure or cultural or even moral structure. So energy security is not of energy, it's not by energy, and it's not for energy. It's something, almost a paradoxical way, different. It's both energy and something else. It's governed by a number of forces which are not energetic, political, cultural, social, etc. In Izabela Surwillo's work, I mean, I read, as I hope you have the chance to, the 2 pieces that she suggested. Well, there were actually 4. I read the 2 most recent pieces that she suggested. And there she suggests that the flow of energy is understood and lived in a constellation with social identities, who we are, defined by values, what's important to heat up, or what's important to drive a car to, or what's important to use energy to accomplish. So social identities in this sense, and technological imaginaries, what we think we can create, technologically speaking, by using energy. And then Johannes Kester, in his most recent work, which I'll mention again in a minute, the variation in the supply of energy is correlated with a number of other non-energy factors like affect, like emotional response, affect, social anxiety, the fear of running out of energy, or a fear of break in energy. And all these ideas that come out in Johannes' work are somehow tangential to energy. They're not purely, strictly speaking, energy. That's a bit, from my perspective, at least, sort of the point of gravitation for the evening's discussions. So I've even gone so far as to say in this paper, I was joking with Izabela, but it hasn't quite gotten published yet. I argued that to talk about energy security, we have to talk about the energy of security. So what's the sort of energetic human forces that make security a meaningful thing? But this is not my evening. This is for others. So let me introduce our guest. Izabela Surwillo is a postdoctoral researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen. And she's a background in international relations with a focus, not surprisingly, on energy security and security studies. And currently she's working on the development of new energy infrastructure. She's going to talk a bit about that tonight, and the displacement of security authority, in particular in the Baltic region. I think this was a thesis work.
It was Germany, Poland, Ukraine.
Exactly, which comes back. I'll come back to this lovely book. Germany, Poland, and Ukraine. So she's authored this very nice book called Energy Security Logics in Europe. It's 2019, I think. But I mentioned it, I hold it up because we had the privilege of putting it in the series that we edit here at the Superior called New Security Studies from Ratic. So that's available now in the lobby. There's only one copy. But then more recently, a really lovely report from Danish Institute of International Studies, and an article in Geopolitics entitled Energy Security Innovation in the Baltic Region. Johannes Kester is Senior Research Associate at the Transport Studies Unit and at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. And he's previously worked on energy security, electricity grids, electric mobility. And now he's working on security governance beyond what these are his words, road-based transport with a focus on safety, insurance, and surveillance practices. And he's the author, most recently, of a very nice article it's in the bibliography, entitled "The Scare Behind Energy Security." So this affective dimension of energy security. 4 conceptualizations of scarcity and a never-ending search for abundance, which appeared in the Journal of International Relations and Development. So we're going to start with Johannes and move on to, maybe we'll even talk about these 4 categories. No. Briefly, okay.
If we have time.
Okay.
Or if you ask questions.
Okay. And then we'll move on to the floor is yours. So maybe turn on your microphone and I'll turn off mine.
Let me.
Mine is
If I turn mine on.
That should be edge here.
Let's see it now. Is there another? Let's try it now.
Yeah, we just can't hear them moving. But they never ask questions anyway, do they?
Oh, one of those audiences. Okay, let me. Oh, sorry. It's all mine. So yeah, let's see. It should be coming up now. I'll also switch my webcam on. If I can. Yeah, so people online can see me as well. Okay, welcome everyone. Glad that you're all here this late evening in the dark and the rain. My name is Johannes Kester, and the speaker kindly introduced me. I'm a senior research associate at the Transport Studies Unit at the University of Oxford. And your first question is probably, what does somebody studying transport have to say about energy security? I can tell you that quite easily. I wrote my PhD on energy security, and I've been following it on the sidelines ever since. My book was called The Politics of Energy Security, Critical Security Studies, New Materialism and Governmentality. Theories around energy security. How do we see it? And how do we work with it as energy security scholars? After that, I moved on to electric mobility and vehicle to grid. I moved on to the social sciences around energy, the adoption and transition towards new energy systems. In this case, electric mobility, electrification, the impact on electricity grids. But even there, I kept thinking about security governance in a broad sense. And what I mean with security governance, I will highlight in a little bit. But basically, one of the articles I wrote was about range anxiety, that people were not buying electric vehicles because they were afraid that the car wouldn't make it to their destination, that it would strand halfway. We've all had that fear at some point if you drive in a car. But what does it mean socially, philosophical? How does it fit in the theories that were that article, for instance? More after my period in Denmark on electric mobility and energy transitions, I took the next step. I was half in energy transport and I moved to transport with a little bit of energy. And at the moment I'm talking to car insurers. How is the insurance industry handling the increasing automation of vehicles, especially when the car will drive itself, and we now have cars on the road in Germany and the UK who are allowed to do that. Who's responsible when something happens? Who's liable legally? How does it impact their risk assessments? So the security governance of transport as a very narrow field. What I wanted to do today are two things. I want to discuss briefly with you what I find during my PhD, what I struggled with was how do I combine this notion, this field of energy, these energy systems, with all these beautiful works I read in critical security studies, work by Peter and colleagues. My professor Jaap de Wilde from securitization theory and others. How do I combine those two? I'll try to explain my reasoning and where I ended up. And then that is what the first thing that I will share with you. And I've called it the vulnerability of the energy security concept. And Peter touched upon it a little bit as well. What is it? We can use it for almost everything or nothing. So that's what I want to do in the first 15, 20 minutes. And then the last 10, hopefully, I'll spend on, okay, so we have this notion of energy security. It reproduces certain vulnerabilities. And I've highlighted, I briefly discuss some obvious ones, and then I take a next step deeper, which draws on the paper that on scarcity that Peter was telling you about. So first question, energy security as security. There are well-framed definitions about what energy is. If you ask a scientist, they can tell you what energy is. If you ask a social scientist, energy becomes a lot more tricky. Security is even harder to understand almost. And energy security. It always tries to do good. It tries to as the International Energy Definition states, it tries to create uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an affordable price. As somebody wrote, Chapman Jewell, I think, in 2014, what's security about this? Where's the security in this? It's about affordability, availability, uninterrupted. Is that it? Sharp and Jewell themselves redefine it in one of the most recent drastic changes to energy security as low vulnerability of vital energy systems. Vulnerability, thanks to today's course, they define as a combination of exposure to risk and resilience capacity. Again, I ask you, what is the security here? Because in popular language, and some in the field have tried to do as well, security is not risk. Risk is its own thing. Security is its own thing. Resilience is a completely different thing. So again, what do we do with this? Now, energy security, one of the key problems energy security has compared to the literature that is often what I throw together as critical security studies is that it doesn't focus on people. It focuses on social technical systems, energy systems. And that makes the whole discussion different. It's one of the things it does is that the theories don't apply. Security, when I was doing my thesis and later on, we still see PhD students working with securitization theory, and we will see an uptick now with the last year going forward, which is actually one of the clear cases where it is probably useful. But when I tried to use it, securitization theory didn't help me at all, because energy is all around us, and it is governed on a daily basis. So that notion of extraordinary measures that define successful securitization or not, and I hope that you are aware of securitization theory because I'm taking some assumptions here. It doesn't work because in the energy systems, you don't take exceptional measures. In fact, most of the work in energy, everyday work is about designing a system that doesn't come to extraordinary momentum experiences. So the energy security literature, I realized, is very hard trying to do any security the proper way. It's either doing its own thing based on policies and what they see in the field, or they use securitization theory. Nobody was working with governmentality, security practices, and all these notions of that study the everyday design of an energy system. It's coming slowly. Peter Forman, Kester, Studier, and others are working on these things. For me, this was a question at the time. And again, to repeat, because this is what we studied. We studied pipelines, electricity cables, oil bunkers, a house with appliances. And yes, gas shortages, disruptions. Now I might have been sneaky because I did it deliberately, but there are no people here. The focus is on these systems, on supply chains, it is about the materiality of these systems. Most of the critical security studies literature doesn't discuss materiality. It's about discursive, about the non-discursive, the role of discourse. So how does that come on? How does that work? Well, this very strong presence of these systems, these social technical systems as we call them, social technical systems that are around. Some of the pipelines, electricity cables are over 120 years old, and they still work. Roads, once constructed, stay for decades and hundreds of years. You don't change systems like that on a whim. The whole purpose is to keep them going. So instead of what I saw in migration studies, terrorism, police studies, where it's all about risk analysis and filtering out those people who behave abnormally, this is all about keeping the system going, which is a completely different logic, as it were. So how do you conceptualize that? How do you theorize that? How does it fit within that security literature as a body of security? Because it is a subfield of security, we all agree on that. So I went back to the actual literature that was trying to, I was actually not asking what is energy, but I was asking what is security, which brought me to, for instance, Darian and the 1988 Baldwin's paper on values and who, and those three questions. But why I like Darian, this 1995 piece, is because it shows that there are so many different forms of security, different ways of expressing it, different ways that we use it in our daily language. I was thinking, what else is security? I can secure tickets for a concert. It's also, so the language is broad, it's open. But if we think about security, the concept, that notion that we all study as security scholars, including us energy security scholars, then there are a couple of things that are always there. And when I try to pick them out, it's the first thing is the pink elephant. Security is always related to insecurity. Safety is always related to unsafe, non-safety. And you can't think one without the other. That's what my old professor used to call the pink elephant. If you say we're all safe here, the first thing you think is, sure, but there are windows, you can jump, and there might be fire. It's inherent to how we use security. It's that dichotomy, duality is there. There's the choice, and Peter addressed it a little briefly, is what are we protecting? Who is doing the protecting? But mostly it's about what do we not protect? Security ignores that. Security is very selfish. That's my interpretation. We're now because of climate change, climate security, import dependency, we're now shifting our car fleet to electric vehicles, which means mining in Africa for lithium, cobalt, and other things. The security literature never pushes that far in. It stops. The system that it studies is very narrow, focused on the self. There might be focus on the other, and I think Izabela will talk more about that. But beyond the self and the other, the subaltern is ignored. It's the people we don't see, don't hear, but who are suffering from what we do. There's a time aspect. Security is always about something that hasn't happened. If it happens, then it's not the threat. Then we face a new threat. It's surviving the building that has collapsed on us. It's not the threat of a building collapsing. So there's a time focus. It's always something in the future. It is a future imagined event. And there's a void. I know I call it a void for this presentation. I don't know. But security always moves across reference objects. The moment we're done with one topic, we move to the next. It might come back, but security is always moving forward. It is inherently empty. We fill it in while we use it. It is a discursive practice. What does that get me? If I look from that energy security perspective to security, what does security mean for me? And I started to make a list. So all these different fields that we have, all these different articles about health risks, about safety. We don't discuss safety in the security literature. I don't find that very interesting. But safety is a very particular logic and engineering logic that underpins most of our society. There is hardly anything that doesn't have a safety decision behind it. That means some people make decisions about, I don't know, these chairs are not linked together, but I know that there are countries where they need to be linked together. People have been, running away, how do you call it, competing during a fire or something. So the chairs blocked the exits in the end. Definitely, yeah. And once I started making this list, you realize that they're not the same thing. We have techniques. I don't have time, so please keep. Yeah. We have techniques by which we get to know the future. If you say that security is always about the future, then we need to study the techniques, the ways we get to know the future. Imaginations, scenario studies, training exercises for doctors, for police officers, etc. Risk calculations, extrapolations. All these things, there are many others. I'm not trying to be exhaustive here. These are ways that we get to know the future. And while we get to know it, we're already applying a rationality to it. We apply it into a rationality of safety, of danger, of risk, of threats. What in popular language is called security from a rationality perspective is a threat logic. Somebody does something to me. It's always the other, the self and the other. I'm happy to explain these further. What I wanted to highlight last is that while those two go hand in hand, the moment we get to know something, we already, in that moment, define the we place it in a rationality. Somebody speaks it in a certain rationality. Then the next level of politics comes in, and we decide on the measures, the countermeasures. I'm not allowed to use that word because apparently security doesn't do countermeasures anymore, but prevention, deterrence, preemption, precaution, preparedness, resilience, or surveillance are all practices that actually do security, that try to prevent that horrible future from coming to be. So for me, security is not threats, but it is this interaction between these various techniques, rationalities, and practices. I find it very interesting that people focus, that there's a lot of focus on in securitization, on threat logics, in risk studies, on risk. But I haven't seen a lot of work that studies when people in power use a risk logic versus a group of local inhabitants who use a threat logic. What happens then? What happens security-wise when you have people using a different rationality, a different fear towards those in power? How does that debate go? How does it shift? That was one of the things I tried to do in the paper in the end. So what is energy security? Trying to move on. For me, when I had to start to define it, and everyone needs to have definitions in their thesis, energy security entails the modes through which people identify and rationalize potential harmful energy futures and act upon them in the present. It is a mode of governance. It is something that is used. It is something that simultaneously produces itself, that understanding that we have of energy security, as well as the energy systems that we have in place. So it is both discursive and material discursive, this is a term from Karen Barat. Basically, I'm mixing Karen Barat and Foucault here, which is the notion of circulations. Circulations as flows of goods, because energy systems are about protecting the flow, not from beginning to end, allowing it to open up and keeping it going. So that for me is energy security. Ooh. So I have to discuss the vulnerabilities. Yeah. So with an understanding of energy security like that, and I can talk for a lot longer about it, what kind of vulnerabilities are behind that? If you see it as a form of governance, as a governance technique, how is it used? If you look at traditional energy security literature, International Energy Agency reports, national reports, it's always about national energy security. In contrast to food, which is mostly studied on a household level, in statistics, in their reports and statistics, food security is done on a household level. Energy is almost always measured and calculated and secured on a national level. That means that you ignore communities. That means that you ignore communities inside your country, and as well as outside of it. I've mentioned the lithium cobalt example, and the children mining our cobalt at the moment. A focus on social technical system vulnerability ignores the individual. This focus on these systems somehow makes energy poverty a different topic. Why is energy poverty a different topic if the definition is affordable energy for all? Apparently, we have an implicit assumption of when energy poverty, people not able to afford to keep their house at 21 degrees for a certain amount of money, when that is too bad, when it becomes too bad or not. Clearly now, this last summer and winter, we've seen that there is a divide, that there is a limit somehow that was crossed. And in the UK, in the Netherlands, elsewhere, people are getting money to support them throughout the winter months. And then the focus on these energy security that is inherent in these concepts, in these definitions, that the focus that derives from it is focusing also where you look and what you ignore. And that's what I mean with security as being inherently selfish. The other thing is that if we focus on crisis in energy systems, we forget the instrumental use of energy security by people in power, with vested interests. You can argue for wind and solar energy from say a dependency argument. We need to become independent from oil and gas. So we get homegrown wind and solar. You can also use an energy security argument to say that intermittency is horrible. We need more baseload energy instead of wind and solar, which fluctuate too much. People use energy security from different perspectives, different elements. And then underneath, and this is I'm almost there, underneath all of this is that energy security, as it is used in Western literature and in the West, is securing a deeper, is hiding a deeper vulnerability. And while it has nothing to do with energy security, I do like this quote from the former Minister of Finance from Greece, that nothing is reproduced with greater ease than the fate of the haves that they deserve what they get. When our eyes fall on those who lack the bare necessities, we immediately sympathize and express outrage that they do not have enough, but we do not for a moment allow ourselves to think that their deprivation may be the product of the same process that led to our affluence. He writes this about the economic system, about economics in general. This is just a regular affairs. Security studies when this goes wrong, when we're actually hurting. And then the selfishness comes in. And that is what I try to do in the paper. What I try to write about is that energy security, it tries to create abundance, but it fails. Except when it comes to what it produces, that ideal notion of abundance. Abundance in itself, in reality, material reality, is impossible, because the markets, the economic markets and systems we have set up in place will never cater for abundance, because there's no money in it. And thus, we will never have abundance or the ability to not care. There will always be people who need to choose between one suitcase or two suitcases when they fly, between heating their house or buying food, just to get some extremes there. It's that notion of caring, that they have to spend energy, emotional energy, caring, making choices about what they do and what not. Instead, energy security, in my understanding, reproduces what it actually works on is shortages, disruptions to that system. So it reproduces these shortages, but it translates them as absolute scarcity. Absolute scarcity is the Malthusian notion that the world doesn't have enough, that at some point we'll be out of oil, that at some point the lithium will be gone. What to do? That is the logics that energy security reproduce. That is what they try, that is what you see underneath discussions about energy security. What you don't see is the realization that energy security, in doing that, is not touching upon the fact that we actually create these systems. The inherent scarcities spread out over these systems, not spread out in the immense sense of that spread out over a population, not in a region where you can see it, it's spread out, so it becomes a statistics. We create these systems. This scarcity is of our making. And energy security, especially when under emergency situations, when there are disruptions or fear of disruptions, they ignore all of that. Yeah, so basically, and then I'll end on that. In securing shortages and promoting interventions against absolute scarcity, security is also used, energy security and other securities are used to call up for investment, for public investments in specific technologies. We see it for electric vehicles, we see it for solar energy, we see it for nuclear. People call upon energy security arguments to argue for financial investments in their innovations or the products. Promoting interventions against absolute scarcity, energy security protects unlimited desire and the mechanisms that support it. And you should have, I probably should explain that perhaps afterwards. But you want to? Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm taking up time. So, yeah. So within the literature on scarcity, they make the distinction between shortages, Malthusian absolute scarcity, and relative scarcity. Relative scarcity is is hidden in the neoliberal economic thinking. It's the notion that there might be limits to what resources we have in the world, but with science, innovations, there will always be substitutions. There will always be a way to move beyond these absolute limits to something new. And behind that drive for innovation, for substitution, efficiency, is the notion that we do not question demand. We do not question our consumption. Energy security is very good as well in saying that consumption is the independent variable in most of the analysis. It's growing. We try to slow down the growth, but will never go down. So that is relative scarcity is an alternative way of thinking about scarcity. Scarcification is actually thinking about the social construction of scarcity. What I tried to explain with saying that these notions of scarcity that we are having in the system are there because we partly built them in the system. And philosophy gives various mechanisms for that. Private property, money, a lot of things are socially driven. We compare ourselves to each other, and that is in fashion, but it's also in other consumptive use. We all have those here, I see. And there's the political economy of social hierarchies. This is here. It's the notion that we have built a society where you need to invest money to grow to the top. We are here, I'm from Oxford. People pay big money to get that degree. Why? Because it gets you further in the door. But at the same time, it's a pyramid game. There will never be more. There will never be more than one president. There is a social hierarchy, and we always created hierarchies. So you always need to do more to be special, to be powerful. And the doing more is consume more, drier. Yeah. Means scarcity and not abundance. You don't create abundance in a system like that. It's just theoretically, for me, impossible. Yeah, sorry.
Please don't apologize. Thank you very much for that. From my point of view, like you warned, it would be many concepts, and this is delicious chocolate cake to dig into.
Yes. If people have questions afterwards, it's not clear, feel free to email or whatever.
I do think if Izabela will give me 2 minutes to make a parenthesis about securitization theory.
Of course.
Yeah.
Maybe I need to turn my
Perhaps, yes.
Because in France, strangely enough, in France it's very rare. Have you heard of it? Do you know what it is? Anybody who doesn't know what it is? I'm sorry. No, but there's no literature on it in French. There are no books, or one or two, in French language on it. But so I just wanted to say one word about it, kind of give you a very short definition, and Johannes knows more for as much as me anyway. We talked in the first 2 lectures about the idea that risk is not a fact. It's the starting point of this whole course. It's the starting point of my work in France the last 10 years. Risk is not a fact. It's an experience. It's a socially constructed experience. And this is directly inspired from securitization theory, which says that a security threat is not a fact, an empirical, objective, concrete fact, but rather it's the product of a certain convergence of social values which appear in discourse. And the real concrete version of securitization theory, the one that lives still in Groningen in the Netherlands, where Johannes did his undergraduate work,
Everything.
and in Copenhagen, where Izabela is working, go a little bit down the street from this. So these are the pillars of securitization theory you have, ladies and gentlemen, in front of you. It's very much the same idea that there's a theoretical process by which something becomes a security threat. It's by someone or some group which has a certain kind of political agency political actorness, political force, declares something to be a security threat. We're under threat by Islam, some politician says. And then it becomes a threat. Not because it's objectively a threat, though there are certainly mixtures of the two, but because it's become a discursive threat. Bono says that HIV/AIDS is the biggest threat to Europe. Who's got more subscribers on Instagram than Bono? Well, not many. And so it becomes the center of attention, and it becomes thus securitized. This is the basic, that's the 2-minute version of securitization. The idea, security threats to energy security are not factual, they're constructed socially by interactions between people who have shared or competing values about what's important in life and what's not.
There's a major role for the audience in securitization.
Very good.
The audience needs to accept the threat. You can claim everything, but if the audience doesn't take it up, then it's not.
Right.
Then you're just spouting nonsense.
We also add from the region where energy policy is frequently securitized in Central Eastern Europe that extraordinary measure in economic sector would imply that you might, for example, develop projects which are not based just on economic calculation, as it is usually the case. So it's going beyond what's considered normal politics. So, for example, in Poland, they would say we're gonna, or in Lithuania, years ago, they said we're gonna construct LNG terminal, although we have all this supply of cheap gas from Russia. However, it is a matter of national security. It doesn't matter how much it costs, we're gonna go for it. And that was a political decision. They were still conducting studies, for example, on economic calculation. Does it make sense to do that project? But it wasn't done because it was extraordinary measure against perceived or potential threat from Russia based on historical experience.
No, it's very next step in securitization theory. It transforms a security threat from ordinary to extraordinary. So it lets us suspend regular democratic security politics and say, no, we have to have a new law, an emergency law. I think of the example of the
COVID lockdowns.
COVID lockdowns, very good. I was going to name Nice, the terrorist attack in Nice with the truck, and then the day after, there was a new état d'urgence, a state of urgency in France, which suspended democratic ways of doing security and made them extraordinary, like Izabela just said. And it's been renewed. We're still under that, actually. Now, what is it? How many years later? 3 years later. It's been renewed 3 times, this law. So we're still under emergency terrorist lockdown, not to mention COVID, because of Nice. And that's the political powers there. So we did. The Secretary of the Internal Secretary of France renewed it 3 times. Okay, now we'll give the floor to Izabela. This is not a class about securitization, but
Thank you.
turn on your mic there just to be.
And here it is on the slideshow. Yes, so thank you so much. I will, yes, yes, it's unmuted. For the invitation and for the opportunity to talk today, I just want to say as a matter of introduction that we sort of agreed that since there will be like one very theoretical presentation, I took a liberty to preparing a very empirical one. So I'm not actually going to address the frameworks that I have been using before. One is in my book, which I actually look at how different security logics, energy security logics, which is securitization, but also risk logic, this logic of day-to-day politics, and also what I conceptualize as emancipation. Without the video.
You don't want to look at this.
No, but then others can't see you.
You see me in the panel. Yeah.
Just far away.
We can look at you. Nice to note. Come on. There we go.
Here we go.
Okay.
All right.
The mic is good. Yes.
So I was basically saying I'm just going to do a very empirical presentation and talk about the case of Ukraine and try to basically play with this idea how different vulnerabilities when it comes to energy security concept more broadly might play out in different cases. So I will not go much into that because it was already addressed. There is in broader perspective also by Johannes, energy security as such, I mean, energy insecurity, the other side of it, of vulnerability, this is like a highly contested concept, meaning that there are multiple definitions of it. Someone counted, I think it was Sovakol in one of his publications, just in literature, at least like 45 definitions, and that was just literature on energy security. And then if we go into strategic documents, talk to practitioners and ask them, about energy security, there are like just multiple definitions and multiple dimensions and aspects that can be included in them. And the same goes for energy vulnerability. So basically thinking about today and like thinking about the case that I wanted to bring, I was thinking about the situation in Europe now, and it's really hard to ignore that we are all really facing energy crisis, and that this crisis is taking place in a specific geopolitical context. And this context is not new, it's just that not everyone was equally affected or paying attention. So basically, Russia made it part of their strategy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that since they lost kind of influence in the region, they decided that they will start using energy in a strategic manner and energy resources in a strategic manner. And that applied, of course, to the post-Soviet sphere. And then for many years, there were different perceptions, on energy security between different Western and Eastern European states. Johannes was saying that some people ask about security, some people ask about energy. In my previous research, I asked, what's energy security? So I would actually interview people in Berlin, Warsaw, Kiev, and I would start my interviews from that question. And they would give me very different answers and, prioritize different things. But basically what was kind of common for the region is that countries like Germany, they would focus on this economic dimension. And there was for many years this belief, especially in Berlin, that, it's good to have mutual dependence with Russia and establish a lot of interdependencies in the energy sector, because then we're gonna kind of, bring Russia closer to Europe. We'll be more dependent, maybe we'll democratize it also in a long term. However, in Eastern Europe, people would also talk about energy security or security of energy supply, but they would not often understand those concepts exactly in the same way, because they would see security of energy supply also through this security, geopolitical dimension, where basically over-dependency, for example, on Russian energy resources was seen as an issue or even as a security issue. And it's only this year that with the outbreak of war in Ukraine and what we are facing now in Europe, that those perspectives are to some extent at the national level at least converging. And the case of Ukraine is an interesting one to look at because it shows how energy security is really not just an economic issue. It's really not just about the economic sector, but is very often intertwined with those political dependencies and national security and geopolitical constellation. And of course, there are effects in different areas when we look at, for example, the case of Ukraine when it comes to political, economic, societal area, how people get affected when it comes to energy security. When we look at the level of the entire energy system or specific energy technology. So I'll just go into that case, looking at three basically periods and how those different vulnerabilities in the case of Ukraine and Ukrainian energy system were basically how they played out. Before 2014, between 2014 and 2022, and this year since the outbreak of war. So when we talk about Ukraine before 2014, this was already kind of mentioned, like when you think about this materiality of energy infrastructure, right? Energy infrastructure is costly and it takes a long time to build. And when it's sometimes built, it stays there for a long time. So it creates certain technological lock-ins and dependencies that are very often long-term. And this was the case in the Soviet Union. So of course, the different parts of Soviet Union were connected through those different pipelines that were supplying gas and oil. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were left with that infrastructure. And they were basically left in this, locked into those dependencies for many years. It was very hard to diversify because oil you can diversify, but like gas, it's hard to transport. It has to be either pipeline or LNG terminal, which is very costly to build. So Ukraine ended up, for many years in the state of dependency on Russia. and Russian energy resources, especially cheap Russian gas, which Ukraine was buying for way below market prices. And it was really helping Ukraine domestically because it has very energy intensive industry. So it had to keep it going. On the other hand, also population was not very used to or motivated to save energy as long as, you know, gas prices were low. So this was also, but it was keeping Ukraine in this state of dependency with strings attached, because it always gave Russia this additional area where it could basically blackmail Ukraine and put another source of pressure. Of course, overdependence was seen as a concern, but there was not a sufficient policy response for many years. And when we look into like how Ukraine approached its energy security or insecurity, it was still very much through this economic dimension. The debate was mostly about gas prices. That's what general population was interested in. And some other aspects like, you know, environmental acceptability, social stability, they were there, but they were usually not, you know, that important. Sometimes they were even omitted altogether. And that's interesting because even when Russia started to construct Nord Stream 1 pipeline to Europe, Ukraine did not kind of oppose the project as much as some other countries in Central Eastern Europe, such as Poland or Lithuania. Another thing that was quite typical for the Ukrainian energy system and meant to make the country like safe or safer was this idea that they should invest more in big power generation units. So like big nuclear power plants, big coal fire plants, because of the energy demand and like to ensure basically that domestic energy consumption will be met. So that was the picture before 2014. However, that made, when you think about vulnerability and how it can play out, that made Ukraine vulnerable on many levels. So on the one hand, this overdependence on Russian resources meant that Russia could basically, you know, manipulate the energy supply, and there were Ukrainian gas crisis in 2006, then in 2009, when that actually happened, and Gazprom cut the gas supply to Ukraine, showing them also that they can just do it overnight if they wish to. That's about energy sector, but energy and like national security, geopolitics in this case has been always intertwined. So for example, Russia was using, you know, the fact that Ukraine is still dependent on that gas to try to put pressure on Ukrainian government at different times. For example, in 2011, Russia attempted to pull Ukraine away from energy community by suggesting that they're gonna give them cheaper, even cheaper gas than they were providing. Then there was a vulnerability on the part of the society, because the issue was also that people were not really paying much attention. They didn't have to, like there were like a lot of subsidies, gas was very cheap to their energy consumption patterns, and that just created bad habits, and that made it harder later on to change those attitudes. And also when you think about the level of energy system and technology, there was this like status quo and lack of investment, because they basically did not invest enough in energy efficiency or new like renewable energy and technology, but this whole system was going. And perhaps it would be going for longer, but the system was also run, it was like, you know, in the 90s, also the older generation that remember the Soviet Union, older times. However, of course, there were like new political aspirations in Ukraine. And in 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, former president of Ukraine, he refused to sign association agreement with the EU. And that sparked mass protests around Kiev. I happened to be there at the time because I was actually doing a fieldwork for my chapter on Ukraine, which was very unfortunate because I did all the interviews with energy sector specialists, and after that Euromaidan started and then war started, and I had to rewrite the entire chapter. These are the pictures I took from Euromaidan. The younger me, we were in good spirits at the beginning, but unfortunately that quickly turned violent. The protest turned violent. It was a very dangerous time to be in Kiev, and that escalated, of course, with Yanukovych fleeing the country to Russia and Russia invading Ukrainian territories. And as we know, in 2014, Russia invaded some territory. Russia basically annexed Crimean Peninsula, and some of the pro-Russian military groups in the east also occupied parts of like Lugansk and Donetsk region. That was very important for Ukraine. And when we think about like, you know, energy vulnerability and like the big shock that can happen to energy system, I mean, this is as big as it gets, because it's really like cuts out chunks of what constitutes your, you know, domestic energy mix and security. So in Donbass, in the east, there were a lot of coal-rich regions that Ukraine lost. In Crimea, there was a lot of renewable energy, especially solar power. And on top of that, Moscow unilaterally basically terminated 2010 Kharkiv Accords, which basically meant that Russian side was leasing the naval base in Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, until 2042, in exchange of giving Ukraine, you know, cheaper gas. So afterwards, the gas prices increased dramatically. And that was a huge shock for Ukraine. It was like huge, you know, insecurity to tackle in the years from 2014. So what did they do to address those? So they tried to reduce import dependence, and there were new diversification plans, LNG terminal, shale gas, expansion of nuclear energy, reverse gas flow from the West, and they were going with those plans. Those plans were on the agenda for many years, but it's only after 2014 that something was really done. And Ukraine also tried to invest in new solutions, just like renewables, finally energy efficiency measures. This was like the big one, how to address like domestic insecurity by a number of governmental programs and so on. It also emphasized more the development of nuclear energy. However, it still had to like import some fuel from Russia, and it also invested into decentralization reform. So a lot of power was given to this like local communities in Ukraine, and they started to, you know, do more locally in terms of like improving energy efficiency and improving energy security locally. And that also meant loss of some power on the part of some lobbying businesses. What's also important when you think about energy security and how it intertwines with like geopolitics is that after 2014, Ukraine changed also, it reacted much stronger to the development of Nord Stream 2 project. Because that was, you know, it was being developed after the conflict with Russia started. So geopolitical considerations were back in, and they were back in because if we look at the pipelines, Ukraine basically felt that, you know, the emitting pipelines that Russia was constructing, it was making the entire region more vulnerable economically, because Ukraine was a transit state, so it had like revenues from being a transit state. Politically, because it was about energy, but if Russia could go around the region, then Ukraine had less of a, you know, maneuvering power vis-a-vis Moscow, because it was not so important anymore. That was, and also in terms of energy supply, because if the gas would just go around, then Ukraine would be only supplied directly from Russia, and Russia could just close the tap, affecting Ukraine, but not affecting the rest of Europe. And this is the reason why countries in the region really opposed so strongly development of Nord Stream 1 and later Nord Stream 2 projects, that they see it as a, you know, undermining solidarity and actually energy security of the entire region. And that's what former Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko said, that this is a political, Nord Stream 2, it's a political project against Ukraine. And he considered this economic energy blockade of no economically justifiable basis established to harm his country. Also had some other quotes which I thought I put here because they didn't age very well, considering how the crisis in Europe is developing. One is that also Petro Poroshenko said that Nord Stream 2 is basically the Trojan horse for European security, which threatens not only the energy security of the European Union, but also its geopolitical security. So it was this like spillover from, it's not just about energy. They kept saying it's also about the wider security issues. Another one was by the deputy chairperson at the time, who in one of the channels said that Russia will win victories and we do not know when it will stop. Because today the Nord Stream 2 project is a weapon that Russia has already delivered to Berlin. And the only question is when we will use this weapon. She will use this weapon. So yes. And of course, as they were petitioning against Nord Stream 2, Ukraine was doing a lot domestically to change things. I was in Ukraine again in 2013 and then again in 2019, and I was amazed how much has been done. Also at the local level, how much has changed for the NGO sector, how this, huge energy insecurity that they were put in 2014 actually mobilized also the population to do something about it. However, this year, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And what we're seeing now, if we think about vulnerability, it's an entire new chapter of what energy vulnerability actually means at times of war. We have a winter ahead, and Russia specifically targets critical energy infrastructure, especially since beginning of October. They are specifically, with missiles and drone attacks, they're trying to damage it. And 40% of the power system is currently damaged. There is a negative impact of power grids and energy supply. And basically this damage to heat and power, this influences a lot, this impacts a lot the local population, because it's about access to electricity, it's about water, pumps that are needs to be used to require, for energy, and it's about heat. Also in the occupied territories, Russia currently 80% of the basically wind and solar power plants in Ukraine are in the occupied territories because they are in the south because of the weather conditions, and those territories are occupied now by Russia. And there is also a risk of potential another cyber attack on the Ukrainian power grid that everyone is afraid of. So what impact does it have? Of course, there is always with energy, it's always the case, it just spills to other sectors. It has this multidimensional impact. On the one hand, economic impact it's going to be huge, but it's hard to estimate because the war is still ongoing. It's only after it ends that we can have like a number for it. There's a societal impact though. As you know, more than 1,000 cities are experiencing blackouts in recent weeks. 4.5 million Ukrainians have no power now, and this, of course, has an impact on the humanitarian situation in the region. So Ukrainian refugees were also recently urged not to come back to Ukraine for winter if they are abroad, because the system might not be able to manage. And this, this energy poverty that is basically on the horizon means that currently there is, for example, wood collected for heating and distributed for free in Ukraine to the most vulnerable groups. This, of course, has a political impact on Ukraine, but also on the neighboring countries when it comes to new wave of refugees, and a security impact because this disrupted power supply threatens military operations, especially, for example, if communication lines are impaired. There is also something that is like really my last point I wanted to address, which is about vulnerability of energy infrastructure and how different considerations can also change here depending on the circumstances. So now we see that Russia really targets like critical energy infrastructure in Ukraine, of course, going for the big power generation units, such as nuclear power plants, coal-fired power plants, and so on, because they're easy to target. And, when we think about the alternatives, or which is, for example, having centralized or diffused energy, of course, when it's diffused and it's people engaging in renewable energy production, this is harder to target as times of war. This is one of the reasons why it's a shame that Ukraine doesn't have more of this diffused energy at the moment. Another thing is attacking the nuclear power plants, which is riskier, but it did happen, as we know. So here are the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. And Zaporozhye, which was basically on the conflict line, got, there was shelling, there was damage to power lines supplying the nuclear power plant, and that raised, of course, a lot of international attention and concern regarding nuclear safety. But what's interesting about Ukraine, what I found interesting, is that there was not much. I expected Ukraine, which had Chernobyl disaster in 1986, that this risk logic when it comes to risk of nuclear energy will be kind of very present in the domestic discourse, and that it will be of much concern to the population. But it's not the case. It was not the case. It was not really high on the agenda. Other economic issues kind of overshadowed it. And it's only now that it kind of came back with double force in the context of war, when, the catastrophe, like as the experts were saying, the one in Chernobyl is not likely to happen, but it could happen. But something could happen in Zaporozhye. So now it came back to the fore. And the last thing is that it's also interesting like, you know, what's secure, what's not secure in terms of energy infrastructure when you are a transit country at war. So this is a map that a colleague of mine at compiled at the end of March, when basically it was showing the attacks, Russian attacks in Ukraine, that somehow never managed, you know, to reach any pipelines, because the pipelines are, you know, we're still transiting gas to Western Europe. So this was critical energy infrastructure for Russia that was kind of protected at the time, even though it was in Ukraine. So those considerations, what's vulnerable in a system and what's not, also change very much depending on the circumstances. So what are concluding thoughts? Well, this is just one of the empirical cases that everyone keeps talking about. Energy vulnerability, or like what can happen in a system, it of course has multiple and shifting dimensions, and they really also depend on the perceptions and on the context of what is happening in the country. And the Ukraine case also illustrates that many phases of such energy vulnerability, which are also increasingly of concern in Europe. So we have it's not only about the, you know, supply, it's about skyrocketing energy prices, it's about the geopolitical situation, it's about migration right now, it's about food shortages, right? Because there is a war in Ukraine and just this spills over to multiple other sectors. And because we are so interconnected, then in times of crisis, those interdependencies also make us all more vulnerable. But hopefully we'll find a way to tackle those vulnerabilities going forward. So I'll just stop here. Well, it was...
Floor is open. As usual, you please ask in French if you prefer. Also, you online.
You online, ask your questions if you like in French or English, and we'll translate as needed. I can just start by asking you really should be straightforward, but that's not seem to be straightforward. Why you both agreed? Why are there multiple definitions of energy security? Why are there so many? Why is there an inflation? Is it like strategic because it's so strategically easy to use, or I mean, just is there a simple explanation?
I found it because during my interviews, I was actually asking people to tell me what's energy security, and then they would start by listing priorities in different order, which would tell me what they really think energy security is about. I sometimes have a feeling that this multiplication of meanings comes also from some policy documents that are set, for example, at the Brussels level, and you're meant to, for example, include sustainability in the definition of energy security. But in some places, like in Eastern Europe, it's like imported effect. But when people know that they should mention that dimension, they will talk about energy supply. Well, of course, affordability of prices is important. Oh, and sustainability because there is EU agenda. And then there's so many different aspects to incorporate. And then these definitions also, in a way, like this is like from a political take.
Yeah.
And one more point, I also think just because we're talking about energy sector, which clearly has overlaps with so many other sectors and affects its, you know, societal, environmental sector and political one, and security, the hard security sector, but it's just impossible to grasp what energy security really is by focusing only on one dimension. And that creates a lot of problems because you want to give it justice and possibly catch this dynamic as best as you can, but it's really hard.
So it's partly that it's that it gets instrumentalized, as we use that word in French. It gets instrumentalized. You can use it to do lots of different kinds of politics, energy security, but also because there are different kinds of energy impacts.
Yeah. It's not just energy security. Food security has seen a similar widening over the years. It starts off like energy. It started off before the 70s, but just focusing in energy. It started off with oil. Churchill is one of the most often quoted used quotes in the history on energy security as saying that what was it? Diversification. The only solution for oil is diversification, something like that. Don't quote me on that. It's not the right.
Diversification of what?
Of supply.
Supplies.
Yeah. So this was back in the First World War when the military shifted to oil and petrol and diesel engines, and Yeah, most of them came from British colonies, mostly, I think, Iran, Iraq.
What about if we go back to you said at the beginning, and it was my favorite part of your talk, that everything is energy. Izabela was this with I share this hypothesis, and is that a way of explaining why it's so useful as a political concept? Because there's energy in our emotions, there's energy in our bloodstreams, there's energy in our spirits, and in our cars and bombs.
We're not going as far as
From spirits to bombs.
That's a good title.
yes. So far, the literature hasn't gone to the spirits part. Let's see how whether that works. Let me just quickly, from the 70s, it moved from that dependency of other countries. It started developing to price fluctuations. These days, price fluctuation is as much of a core concern of energy and food security, water security, as dependency on the suppliers. And then that was the 70s with the oil and gas prices, especially the US, very much. Early 90s, sustainability debates came up, and you got discussions about climate change as affecting energy supplies, energy supply chains. So that became involved, and that ended up to well-being and other aspects in the 90s. And these discussions, you can trace them in energy and food and other resources at the same time. It's just society, globalization. We became more connected. Yeah, and it's still, I'm not quite sure it's instrumental. If it just follows how society is developing itself. These days, cybersecurity would be a key component. Even though it's something of itself, it is also inherent to it.
Since we're
Yeah, no, I was just because you said like every energy.
no, Johannes.
But it reminds me of like Felix Chichita's article on energy security and its logics, and he talks about the total logic of energy security and how energy is the prime mover. Like you cannot do anything without it. So just like going back to the question, why is it so important? Because we just cannot function at all without like energy supply, and that's why it affects just so many sectors. It makes it impossible for the current nowadays society to basically function on a day-to-day basis.
I agree. I would go earlier up the energy food chain. I mean, these are all students in geopolitics, so we don't talk much about Jackson, but since Jackson was a professor here at the École, he wrote a book called Spiritual Energy. In which he argued, which is it's part of my unhappy article, of course. That sure, the energy is everywhere. It's in everybody's car, it's in everybody's movement, but it's also, you have to have your coffee and your granola in the morning, or there's no energy in your body, and you have to have the spark of life in your heart, or there's no energy to get you out of there, etc. etc. I won't ask you to comment, but I agree that it's everywhere. That's what I agree entirely with you.
Because that was the follow-up of that article that you mentioned. The quote was total energy. Does that make it plain, or does it make it not secure? If everything is security, is it then, if energy, is it then security? Doesn't then it not become what we see now? The whole, and this is me taking a very academic provocative stand, is what we see now with Russia.
Isn't that energy security or is that national security?
Can we? Is it
still energy security?
Where's the difference?
Well, that's the key question.
It's
it's the strategic military use. That's what you mentioned that. And it's right. So every military is bombing energy installations first thing. The US is bombing Afghanistan and Iraq. Same way. That line between those, where is it?
Who is supposed to draw this line?
Because we cannot be like, oh, we think this is the right definition and we're just gonna impose it on you, because that was the whole thing with my field work in my PhD. I would go and talk to these people And if this is how they understand energy security, and they understand in Poland, for example, it's energy sovereignty. It's not even about supply, it's about sovereignty over the policy choices and so on. And they act according to that rationale. Then it doesn't matter if we think this is the right definition, because this is what they are socialized into thinking, and this is how they basically proceed when it comes to making policies. So I think it also goes a bit. It's so sometimes when you talk to people who actually do energy policy, it's sometimes deeply entrenched. Their understanding of what it is about, that it's really hard, and in some countries, because I think it all depends which country you do research, right? In Western Europe, it's not so much about national security, but here sometimes it's really hard to draw a line where the energy security and where is just national security, where is the identity here, where is the
which makes energy security both highly global and very local. It's highly contextual. Yeah.
I think
where you are, who you are.
Also, like
it's also, if it's contextual, it cannot be the same everywhere, right? Because it's always kind of defined by the context in which we operate. So maybe it's not bad if we leave it open. But it's a critical take. Of course, I think some people are get annoyed that there's. Well, of course, we need a policy framework that will be clearer and have clear indicators. But with energy, what's problematic, many people try to do that, and we just have so many frameworks, and
it's still many definitions and still many aspects to look at.
I mean, I could link this to something we talked about here in the seminar, and it's a huge issue. And I mean, before I moved back to Paris 8 years ago, I worked heavily in critical security studies. And then since, that's a bit what I presented in the first lecture about globalization of security, and there's inflation of security, it's not national security anymore. So since the end of the Cold War, people like Johannes and me, and I guess you in part 2, have been saying, national geopolitics, it's over, it's past. Now there's
I will never say that.
maybe, yeah, this is a very good point, actually. Is there a comment?
But I realized that which microphone do we have on?
I have mine. Okay. Just try putting yours on too and see if it echoes. But I mean, so people from our generation, I'm a little bit older than you two, but people from our generation have been saying, it's post geopolitics now.
No more nation state.
No more nation state wars. I tried to tell you this, the first lesson, the second lesson. And then comes Ukraine and Russia. And then it looks like we were just completely wrong for 20 years of scholarship. And it goes back to exactly what you said. This line has been moving.
That's the wrong way of framing it. Okay. I've seen it happen. I think the Finnish Prime Minister said that energy security has been wrong for 20 years.
Energy, not critical.
No, the energy security goes, how it's being done has been wrong because this happened now. But can't say that. You can't make them right or wrong question.
No, but I mean, terrorists don't blow up oil refineries. They blow up, symbolic buildings with symbolic meanings. And that's been sort of the paradigm for national security in the West, in Western Europe. But it's
like, but it's geopolitics. They say now it's post geopolitics, and then they say now it's the return of geopolitics. And I was just wondering, did it ever disappear?
That's my question.
So like, was it not there for some time, or did we just not see it? Because
they say now the geopolitical context has changed. Has it? Russia was like blackmailing, doing energy blackmail to multiple countries
in the 1990s, early 1990s,
on multiple occasions. I mean, there was like war in Georgia in 2008. They annexed, some of the territories in Ukraine in 2014. But like a lot of things that were happening was not in a political vacuum. Like that everyone knew this is happening. So it's like, well, their geopolitics is not there, or is it now because we are like more directly affected? And when we say SEV, I mean EU, like, more western part of Europe.
Yeah. So it's certainly an evolution in EU expansion or construction, right?
Yeah, and also how they perceive, I don't know, also like where does, Europe, sometimes the Western discourse really ends with maybe not Germany, but like the Central Eastern Europe is not given as much attention.
Yeah.
And there are developments there all the time.
Rumsfeld said that's the new Europe,
Uh-huh.
whereas France and Italy, that's old Europe. We should be attending to it.
Where is energy security scholarship taking place? Where is media? Where does the question was at the beginning was like, who is making security? Who is doing security? Who is writing it? That's us in the Northwestern Europe hemisphere.
In old Europe,
In old Europe.
in Oxford,
For example.
600 years.
Yeah.
I think that's the
Yeah, there was another strain of thought that comes back to me. Sorry.
no, but
So I'm from Poland, but I work in Denmark. I'm based in Copenhagen.
and until this year, energy security, like no one would perceive of this as a security issue. It's like in energy policy, they also focused on developing renewable energy. That was not part of the public debate. Threats from Russia, how far is Ukraine? I mean, all those questions that only kind of surfaced now. So like when we say about Western scholarship, what I was doing a lot this year is me and a colleague of mine who's also like from the region. We're writing a lot about the perspective of energy as a security issue that was in the region for many, many years, that was just not paid attention to by, for example, a lot of Western Europe. So the type of scholars, this is more like a policy work really, because of course, like we look at different things when it comes to concepts and frameworks and like critical approaches. But this is something that is really, that was a clear divide. And I think it's only this year that at least politically those perceptions are maybe more converging. But when it comes to literature on energy, it's definitely Western, right? Like it's that's what's the case.
Yeah, it came back to me. What I wanted to say is that we also have a different ethics about what security should be.
We in the Northwest.
Within the Northwest. So, because we have seen changes in the relationship with Russia and gas relationships with Russia over time. I think after 2016, we got the first flow capacity, so that the pipelines were no longer only pumping gas into Europe, but also pumping back gas to the Ukraine, but also mostly Balkan. Because when we were talking about 2016, you know way better than that. But the debate was between Russia, Ukraine, and the EU, but the Balkan was definitely cold for like 6 or 7 days. Literally nothing. 80% of their energy was gone. And that's what I mean by the subaltern. We always exclude vulnerable groups from these discussions. At that time, the European Commission standpoint was that economic markets were the best way to go forward to create an energy secure world. That is a very political standpoint. So they did everything they could to create markets with Russia involved in long-term contracts, short-term contracts, more spot markets, more diversification, LNG terminals, but never to the extent that we see now, the plans, because the audience at that time didn't see the severity, because the whole Europe wasn't hurt. Britain actually made money in those phases, the Netherlands as well, because they were exporting more gas. So this going from these very local, because it's Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the world, to Europe, and then you have different positions in that that arena, different understandings of energy security, different threat levels, different risk perceptions, and different ideas about how to solve it. It's very in IR, we both I was still fed the realist, liberalist divide, and the European Commission for liberalists take to cooperation, long-term contracts, diversification, what you were saying, codependency, interdependency, more than anything else. It clearly doesn't always work.
But it's always, but I think the problem within EU is like the national interest, right? And it's
about solidarity as well, and also about different perceptions of threat. But again, there was not enough dialogue. I mean, there is always this, there's a divide, but also there is this perception, I think, of the Central Eastern Europe just catch up with the rest of us. Oh, this is something about Russia, a little bit paranoid. Like, so there is a little bit of that in those negotiations, but just lack of understanding and like economic interest. Interdependence is a great idea. It's just that the question is, would that work outside of EU concerning Russia? Because the question is, does Russia also think that interdependence is a good idea for the same reasons that we think it's a good idea?
Yeah, within the energy security literature, there's the security of supply and the security of demand. The idea that countries that sell energy are dependent on the money income from their sales. And so that's partly supporting that notion of interdependence. Yeah, it's always a very interesting debate, because at some point it's who can bluff the longest, who can do without the longest, and that's horrible. It's the old, almost an old-fashioned chicken game. I can say this because I'm not living in these countries. That's the again, that's us responsibility as scholars, as security scholars, is to always be aware of the wide diversity of people who experience it. You can. I've once sat in a session with feminist security scholars, and this it was one of the most interesting panels ever, because it was all about, if you don't experience the insecurity yourself, can you still write about it? And in this case, it was about, somebody asked in that panel, can I as a man write about the insecurity that we feel when we walk the street? You don't write the same things. That's just not possible. You can still write, but it's not the same.
You mean
no, that's a tangent. But
no, it's interesting. But you don't mean as a feminist, you mean as a scientist.
As a scientist, as a man. Yeah. This was, but also in energy
security.
No, just about security. And this was personal safety. But for energy security, it's the same. Like, I opened my thesis, my book, with the notion that, I admit, I grew up in the Netherlands. We had electricity blackouts, but it was because the lightning hit the wires in the fields. So we just went into the how do you call it, the circuit boards, and we flipped the switch, and it was okay again. That was my experience with energy security. But if someone from Africa writes it, they're definitely, or from Europe, or from Russia, they have different experiences of energy security. So that is, again, one of the reasons why the definitions of security are so impossible and perhaps not even needed. And it is why I feel like we should describe the processes, the modes, the way we think, the way different people think, and the politics behind that.
Yeah, I mean, it brings. Sorry, I'm still watching for any hands.
But it's also like always contextual, right? As you say, but I feel like you can never be as good as someone who experienced that, but you can try to get, do your best by listening to those voices as much as you can, because then you can get the fuller story. So I think with energy security, it doesn't actually help in a way, in my opinion, if you try to have like one common definition, because everyone is just using like an empty concept and empty label, and they say energy security and energy security, but they really don't talk past each other because they mean really different things. So if we just scratch those definitions and let them talk about, okay, what is really at stake, they would say, okay, actually, our security considerations or some economic issue, then they would talk about,
What would they talk about?
That depends. If you put it in the room together, if you put, I don't know.
It's about resilience. I think of this outage that happened in India 4 years ago. The time with India, 600 million people lost power for 3 days.
If we talk about aspects of energy security, of energy supply, they would actually use those dimensions or that are mentioned in the definitions of energy security, but this will also always depend on the context of what is being discussed or what is on the table. So you cannot graph it all in one.
But I mean, I was going to bring up the example because it tells you something about resilience. Because in India for 3 days, no problem, or little problem. It's just life went on because there's one is accustomed to it. Anyway, John, go ahead.
Relating to that, I had an interesting conversation 2 weeks ago. I was in when an old farmer for a hearing meeting. And he was curious in discussion about heating in Paris. People heat too much. Maybe probably knows you heard of it, but it was national debate about 90 degrees heating as something one was to achieve for the winter.
With this lovely name,
Yeah.
Sobriety.
Right.
Which is,
So, yeah, the idea was to limit ourselves so we cannot have power from the winter. We need to make fire and emissions of gas. And he was very curious in generation, saying if we heat, we heat too much, he couldn't recharge his hearing aid. Because if the government is cutting the energy supply, because there was a side debate about the connected electric counters next to the general grid can be turned off, and there was rumors floating around some effects behind it, that some of them would for a limited amount of time be disconnected from. So this all sounds very curious about the idea that we, the younger generation, will not save sufficient energy so we cannot hear. And it strikes us very interesting point of view. And this made me think about this discussion we had here about the 90 degrees, and if there is not really a kind of a change of paradigm in this energy security point mentioned. In the sense that the element of moral government seems to be more important, at least this year. That doesn't change, but that we find arguments we wouldn't have seen from liberal politicians or even right-wing politicians asking for sobriety and for limiting ourselves and for limited government, especially rather with a pivot from growth position now on the others. At the same time, and mini anecdote, the German right-wing, very right-wing party of AfD put up an energy map where you can see blackouts in Germany. You can self-report. Self-report if you have a blackout in your neighborhood, so they can scandalize the lack of sufficient energy, making the link to a more Russia-friendly political position. So all this together is interesting. I find it interesting because it's very much on individual behaviors. How individual behaviors are framing or are influencing or are creating dependencies on more general national political positions and national energy security. So are we heading maybe towards a more mobile approach to energy security? And the second question is there a new form of politicization of this energy issues, even in terms of politics? Because this is a debate on the right hand side.
okay, I need to repeat briefly to our friends. Oh, most of you are online, actually. There's 30 something online. The two questions were: are we? And it came up a bit in your talk. Are we moving towards a more moral approach to decision making or to problematization of the energy problem, or is there a new form of politicization? And it grew out of two lovely anecdotes. But the first was very lovely. That the colleague was in the country and talked with an old farmer who wore a hearing device and was complaining that people in the cities and most of the young people used too much energy, and then the energy would fall out and he couldn't charge his hearing aid, he couldn't hear. So it become a personal moral issue. And that was an example about Germany as well. But, so is it to move towards a more individualized, maybe you would say liberal, actually, just thinking of it, a liberal, ethical approach to political decision making through energy security, or a new form of politics? That's the question. I might have added.
Yeah, I really did. What I find interesting in the question itself, and in a lot of debates these days, is that the discursive views, the shift that we make from the old to the new. Why is there a break? From my perspective, again, being not hurt by all these events or minimally impacted, the debates, the arguments used are the same. The urgency has gone up. Some key actors have changed their behavior, but the logics, the arguments, the rationalities are the same. What we see is that because of those key actors changing their activities, behavior, they use, the threats and the urgency, that notion, that acceptance of the threat has come up. And so the audience has become broader. Is that all new? Like it will go down again as well. These debates are cyclical. Security, it will move. We will have a next trauma, a next crisis.
Well, technology has a history. Technology gives you an old new.
Technological innovation, but even then, the break is often created. The break itself is produced. How do they say this? Tesla is the first electric car. Yeah, no, Norway was producing electric cars in the 1990s. GM was doing it as well. It's the first widely sold, accepted car, sure. But that break with automobiles is a very interesting discursive production in society. It's something to highlight. Are we going to a more moral economy? I think yes, but not for security reasons. This is me talking from the climate change tradition and transition studies. We know that transport, the demand for transport will grow by 2.3%, 2.3 times by 2050. Well, to more than double. The demand for freight will almost double and a half by 2050. 91% of our transport at the moment is fueled by fossil fuels. We need to both increase the way we the passenger kilometers that we drive and the freight kilometers, as well as decrease our dependency on like cars. You can't. There are scenarios and major scenarios where they say that it's possible with many different functions, but that's the thing. Everything needs to change. People have no clue what we need to change in the coming 30 years for climate change, and that necessitates more moral intervention into how we live. We have discussions about the donut economy, this boundary, living a good life, and then the boundary capacity of the world, and in between that we need to live. Of course, nobody knows what is a good life. What is a good life for me is completely different for someone else. Everywhere in the world. I got a question yesterday at class, and now I'm going off on a tangent again, by a student from Africa who said, great that we only need electric vehicles and more public transport. My country can afford the infrastructure costs for a new train track. What do we do? Exactly. What do you do? This is a very Western perspective, and we try to incorporate all the people's experiences. But sorry. Yes. If you can bring it back to energy.
No, I was just thinking because I was at the conference last week in Lithuania when they were saying that with the current energy prices, households need to pay 300 euros more for basically energy bills a month. And the salary level is not what the salary level is in Western Europe. So for many people, that just became unaffordable. And it's like when we talk about this morality, so okay, we might be just self-governing unity and maybe I'll change my behavior, but what is really behind the change in behavior? Because in many cases, it will not be the moral considerations to basically, like we cannot basically use more because we just will not have money to buy food. Or for example, also what sometimes makes me think, like for example, German energy transition and energy planner, right? It was also driven and upheld by a lot of like societal support. People basically, even in opinion polls, saying that they are willing to pay more for energy that does not come from fossil fuels, it doesn't come from nuclear. But now
there are predictions that energy prices in Germany might just like triple by the end of 2023. Will this societal, moment hold through this crisis? I'm not sure. So like they could have, for example, this moral stance, and also especially when it comes to nuclear, because we all want to decarbonize, but nuclear was just like one extra. And they would, have this approach like, why is Poland developing nuclear power plant? Why is France still doing this and that? But then they're now in the crisis, like all of us are. And then the question is whether this is a question of morality or whether you can afford the morality forever. That's something that in my mind when I just look at different debates in different countries.
One last thing that's coming back to your question is that the instrumental use of energy security by a wider group within society, the German extreme right party, doing their version of energy security. Yeah, sometimes I think it's been a lot of things. We can't say what is right and wrong, but we do know what is right and wrong. There will be, and that is when we come to securitization theory, what the audience accepts. A lot of people and groups can bring up their interpretation of energy security and how to solve it. Often the threat is one thing people can agree on, but how to solve it is what distinguishes them. There will be, at some point, a way forward or compromise or and that often depends, on what is affordable, what is acceptable, acceptable for the majority, for the silent majority, which again means that, vulnerable people are left out to keep bringing that up. One thing, if you look for master thesis or PhD thesis, what I find interesting and fascinating of the whole discussion right now is the role of the economic modeling of the price predictions and the spot market developments, and how those predictions have become so real that they have led to responses and have created this reality that we already. Well, we don't know yet what happens next year. But they created all these these predictions, and now the predictions are not actually reaching the price levels that they predict. Why? Because we intervened. That's the other thing about security. If security is applied and used, energy security, food security, elsewhere, if it does its job, the predictions fail. And then people will say, yeah, we overreacted. Did you really? Sorry, I'm making
it's a
little back to,
What's actually a point I don't know if you remember. Another point I made theoretically, first lesson of the course, that security is never reached. Security is impossible. Or only with death. Or you secure, and then you're not secure.
Yes.
No, please.
Just as you said, it's never reached. It might sound a bit pessimistic. I'm sorry, I don't have much time to listen. I was just thinking, what do you think about energy security? Are we bound to say actually insecurity it's with a scarcity, it's limited resources, it's renewable energy with independence and real good technologies? That can be issues, certainly wouldn't be like we're not bound to eventually about energy insecurity, really like more realistic way of an energy issue. Or is it a political thing? We don't want to look energy security make us think we can preserve energy we have, but we know it's one of the ways it's true. So is this a political thing to make people believe that there is to be secure because securitization goes on the political agenda, or this just pessimistic thing that we're going to say that this is energy insecurity because it's always limited resources.
Yeah, just to paraphrase and to shorten a bit for time. I mean, it's the point you both made actually, that there's never enough. Why are we talking? And for the philosophical reason I gave for my two, we'll never reach security. Why aren't we just thematizing and politicizing insecurity instead of talking about security at all?
For me, they're the same thing, because the energy security is inherently about insecurity. It's just the way forward. It's the way we try to absorb those insecurities. Yeah.
I would, sorry, I don't want to jump into because I would agree with that. I agree with the point when you said it's an agenda setter. It's like, you know, energy security, and not only it's an agenda setter, it's positive, but also how we want to achieve it. So if they put priorities in those definitions, we want to get out of the insecurity by doing this and that, by going first after energy, you know, security of supply and sustainability. So it's like a roadmap how to get out of insecurity. And those roadmaps also differ in different places. For me.
That's okay.
Insecurity more about rationality, and security is not about rationality, and people maybe prefer to talk about rationality than rationality.
Yeah.
About the police, because they try to create the ideas as a risk is real and rational, and not the idea that is not rational.
That's actually it's very much it's an extremely good point, because what security does is translating this underbelly feeling of uncertainty and vulnerability into a rationality in which we can act and which we do act. So it is that rationalization. That's what I try to show with my model. So yeah, there are others who argue that we should look more at the insecurities, vulnerabilities, accepting that it's not just epistemological, the fact that we don't know these insecurities, but that it's very inherently ontological. It's just the world is changing. People interact, the world changes, our interaction changes the world, and that brings with it insecurities, uncertainties. And that is uncertainties in mobility across borders, in food, energy, in military space, like yeah. No, it's a very good point. The one thing about rationality and irrationality, as you used it, is that there's a very, again, that's Foucauldian, perhaps, I don't know where I brought it from, but that attributing someone or something as irrational is a political act as well. You're not part of this. What you're saying is crazy. So that is very tricky, because, and this is my ending, perhaps. When I said that I wanted to do more work about security versus threat logic versus risk, in the Netherlands we have gas production, natural gas production. We have earthquakes since the early 1980s. It took until the late 1980s for politicians to believe that there were earthquakes. In the meantime, the farmers were said to be making things up. That the shaking that's just made up. It wasn't until our Meteorological Institute, with one earthquake monitor in the middle of the country, actually caught one on its sensors, that the debate flipped. And over time, that whole debate, for the people, it was about insecurity. There was a threat to their lives, buildings would collapse. And in the meantime, in The Hague, in a political governance center, the companies and politicians were deciding based on risk. The models are saying that these earthquakes are not bad enough for your house to demolish. The economic costs are way cheaper to actually keep pumping gas instead of rebuilding gas, etc. It took them until the early 2000s to acknowledge the payment scheme. And in the meantime, the local population, because of it coming from a different risk rationality, using different language, was put away as weird. Didn't help that they were from the rural aspect of the country, so there were, like you said, from the country. You said it earlier, from the old farmer. There's a connotation. Sorry, I'll stop talking about that.
You have a last?
No.
We'll leave it there with the irrationality. It's naissance technique, first of the clinic, Foucault. Okay, joining and thanking for that speech. La semaine prochaine, donc, on va revenir sur la langue de Marie-Antoinette. Et sera question de Sarah Carré et Antoine Pécaud, surveillance technologique, frontières et asile. Donc voilà, à la prochaine.